with your host, Michael Braithwaite. You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Welcome, Housers, to another episode of On the Way Home. Each week we bring to you wonderful guests that are part of the solution to ending the crisis we're in, have lived through it, are researchers, are people working in the field. We are so fortunate week after week to speak to really, really brilliant people. I nerd out every week over the stuff. Today's guest is a repeat guest, and listen, an incredible guest. And we're not going to, before we get to that guest, I should tell you this podcast is brought to you by the good folks at Blue Door, my organization. 42 years of working hard to support our most vulnerable: housing, health, meaningful employment. We do land trust. We do it all. We're actually tearing down a small house and a big piece of land right now, putting up 14 stacked townhomes. It has been a labor of love, all deeply affordable, some emergency, but mostly independent, living with supports. Really, really cool. And we've had so many great partners around it. Check us out at bluedoor.ca. You can see what the 130 wonderful folks at Blue Door are up to in the north part of the GTA, York, Durham, and Peel. Let's get to today's guest. We have Carolyn Whitzman with us today on the podcast. As she's a professor, an author, a researcher. She's written 6 books. Today we talk about her 6th book that she shared with us. It's called Home Truths: Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis. We talk all about that book. First, we talk about her journey. How the heck did she get to where she's at? She wrote a whole chapter. When we asked that question, what does home mean to you? Her first chapter is, what's it called? Let's see. She's written a whole chapter on what is home, it's called. And we talk about how the book came about, how the heck we got in this mess in the first place. There's a chapter around that, around like how we got in this crisis, how to figure out the need, like what do we really need, and what should we consider when trying to figure out the need. Most importantly, we talk about some of the solutions that she talks about in the book, and we talk about what her hopes are. When writing this book, I know she's met with a prime minister and the housing minister, shared it with them, and she wants to get this in the hands of those decision makers, people that can actually make real change happen. It's a wonderful book. Go out and buy it. You can get it anywhere where you find books, at your local bookstore. And you know what? It's a good read. Even if you're not in the housing sector, if you have friends that don't really get it, share this book with them. It's a wonderful book and a wonderful conversation with an incredible person. Let's go to that conversation now. Carolyn, so happy to have you back on the podcast. We talked a little bit. In fact, you were saying, I think we were talking offline. You said we were one of the first to hear an excerpt from the book. But we want to talk all about that this time as it has been released. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Michael, it's wonderful to be here.
Now, we asked this before, and I think it's the best answer we've ever gotten, because you've got a whole chapter. Your first chapter of your book is dedicated to what is home. So I don't think you have to deviate at all. If you can actually share with us that beautiful answer that you gave us last time, that would be wonderful.
I don't have the book in front of me, but what I have heard as I've talked to people about home is it's a place of safety and security and dignity and fun. And I think the example that I give in my book is, can you just relax in front of the TV at the end of a long day? Can you cook something? Because cooking is so important, I think, to my emotional energy. So to me, it's just a place where you can have privacy, but you can also get together with friends. And particularly when you're very low income, and of course, On the Way Home deals with homelessness, people don't have any money left over from paying their rent to hang out in a coffee shop or to go see a movie. And particularly in the winter when being outdoors doesn't work quite as well, they need a place in or near their home where they can get together with friends and family if their home is small. So without going into the whole chapter, that's sort of some of the highlights.
That's wonderful. It's so interesting. Like even the timing of you saying that today, I think there was two different reports, not today, but recently. So you have the Who's Hungry report from the Daily Bread that they do annually with some dire results. And I think the Toronto Foundation just put out um, a report too on just the cost of living in the GTA, which also was pretty dire too. So we just were bombarded by this, and you're right. Like people, home has never mattered, I think, as much as it does now. And one of the aspects I love that no one's ever really said anything about with home is fun. Yeah, like come on, that's where because your guard's down, you're comfortable. You can actually have some fun. So cool. So thank you for that. You had such an incredible journey. All right. So you're a researcher, professor, an author, and you've been in the city of Toronto. You've been to Australia and now back in Canada. Can you just walk us through some of that? Because you've done a bunch of different things.
Yeah, and I talk about it a little bit in the book because, first of all, I am privileged, and I want to acknowledge that privilege because I came from a fairly middle-class family, something I didn't realize until I was well into my teens. I thought I was poor, but then I discovered people who were poor, and I was like, oh, I'm actually middle class. Because of having white skin and English being my first language and being incredibly generationally lucky to be a boomer, my housing trajectory has been fairly straightforward, and it's been associated with my work trajectory. So, I started off in a small town, Cornwall. When my parents divorced, my mother and I moved to the big city where we became renters. And fortunately, we lived in Montreal with a great stock of low-cost rental housing. So, as a divorcee and single mother, my mother found it relatively easy to be in Montreal. And certainly I loved growing up in a flat, close to school, close to a park, etc. Didn't need a backyard. As I became politically aware and active in Montreal, I became involved in renters' rights organizations, mainly because, again, we were very lucky, and I was able to move out, even though I went to school, Concordia, in Montreal. So I was in the student ghetto, and we were fighting for more housing to stay affordable in the student ghetto. And then when we moved to Toronto, it's a bit of a shock because it was much more expensive in Montreal and harder to find really nice apartment buildings. I ended up working in gender-based violence prevention for the city of Toronto for 10 years, and housing came up because it's very difficult to get out of a violent relationship or indeed escape from a violent landlord if you don't have decent housing. And then in the next phase of my existence, I got a PhD and I got a job in Melbourne, and Melbourne has a very similar housing ecosystem to Canada. Very little non-market housing, such a focus on home ownership that sometimes renters' rights are very difficult. And I wanted to live with my husband and two small children in an apartment. I'd lived in an apartment in Toronto. It wasn't possible. There were bungalows or bust in Melbourne, including in the inner city, which is an experience that a lot of people have in central Toronto now. I was just lucky to be living in co-op housing in Toronto, where it was possible to find a centrally located large apartment/townhouse. And then I have wound up in the last few years back in Canada doing housing policy research. So in all the places that I've lived, I haven't even talked about London, England, but in all of the places that I've lived and the varying jobs that I've had, housing is very central to the choices that we've had as a family, the decisions about housing, moving from rental housing into non-market housing into ownership, were relatively easy for me because we were there at the right time. We were there in Toronto in the 1990s when it was still possible to find a centrally located ownership home. Each time we were able to trade up So I'm not into housing as an investment, but I've benefited from housing as an investment. And it makes me very conscious of, when I talk to people who haven't had those benefits, of how are they going to fund their retirement? How are my children going to have the same kinds of options as I do? Because they don't at the moment. All of those things.
It's so interesting when you talk about the international piece too. We've done an international panel where we're talking about refugee housing. But I mean, what I pulled from that, aside from that, was that we're more alike than we are different in many. Australia being in the UK, just being over and speak. We just had some visitors from the DePaul Society in the UK, and they were talking about they've got a new government now after 14 years of, and just also how housing and housing crisis are linked to changes in government. I mean, the UK was very close to, they had some good numbers on rough sleeping before 2010. Then they had 14 years of a conservative government. And I mean, other things happen in the world as well, but man, like those rough sleeping numbers now are the highest they've ever been. And so, I mean, even in Finland, where we were talking with them, they were talking about, yes, as we all hear, they do wonderful stuff. And you talk about that in the book, but Juha, who's from there, was talking about they've slid a little back again because changes in government, right? A right-wing government, not as much investment. So, I mean, and we're going to talk more about this.
Housing is deciding, I mean, two things out of that, Michael. One is that housing is deciding elections, and without going in depth into the American election, I think it's hard when people see that their children don't have the same opportunities as they do to convince them that what was the case in the US, that unemployment had gone down under the Biden administration, industrial opportunities had increased, but bottom line, they are finding it hard to find affordable housing, and they're finding it, and older people are finding it hard for their kids to have affordable housing. I'm not saying that as an excuse or a single factor explanation of what happened last week in the US, but I think it is part of the narrative that needs to be addressed. But the other thing that you just reminded me of, Michael, is that my book, Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis, I don't really spend that much time talking about the US or talking about Australia or New Zealand or Canada or the UK. They do come into the story, but I'm interested in places that are different, that have modeled ideas that work. And honestly, the Anglosphere has been moving in lockstep, and it's not where the cool ideas are at the moment. Each one has a couple of cool ideas, but that's not where the exciting stuff is coming from.
No, we have, like when you talk about moving the needle, right? That's where you look at. I mean, they've done that, right? And the proof is there. And it's taken 20 years of consistent investment and support, etc. So let's talk about your book. You've written. Is this your seventh or sixth book? This is your sixth book. So you've written 6 books, many books. We want to talk today about Home Truths, which dropped recently on October 21st. We'll talk about, you get it everywhere. Can you share with us, like, how did this book come around? You'd written 5 others, and now this one. What inspired you to write it?
Well, the real question is what inspired me to write the last book, which was something completely different. This book, Home Truths, comes very much out of my work, and my previous books have also come out of my work. So when I returned to Canada from Australia in 2019, I'd already been doing housing research in Australia. One of the things that really struck me were that when I left Canada in, sorry, I need to wave. There we go. In order to get the light back on. Very energy efficient. A remarkable amount hadn't changed in 20 years, the 20 years I'd been away. And that includes the last really good mass market book on housing. And apologies to anyone else who's written housing books, but it was Housing and Homes by John Sewell in 1994. Well, a lot has changed in 30 years. So there's been really great histories of housing policy and really good sort of journalistic cri de coeur about sort of people suffering the impacts of homelessness. But there weren't that many books that were about the housing system in Canada for people who are interested in housing but aren't necessarily researchers in housing. So I felt the need to write that kind of a book. That was really the origin. And a lot of the work that I'd been doing was on planning for affordable housing and work at the federal level. I was very excited, of course, by the federal government being back in the policy saddle in a way it hadn't been in the 1990s and the first certainly decade and a half of the 21st century. So it was time to have an overview of not just what the system is now, that'll change, but where we came from, some good ideas that I think we'd forgotten about. I think it's important to learn from the past. Doesn't mean we'll repeat it exactly, but we should learn from it. And sort of what's going on around the world and where we fit into all of the global discourses that we were talking about affordable housing, because I think things have gone backwards, even in Finland, even in France, even in Singapore, some of the places that we often talk about, even in Vienna, some of the places we talk about as the places that have clearly built a lot of affordable housing and had a lot of benefits from building lots of affordable housing.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say when you go back, this is not a kind of here's what we do, all done kind of thing. Canada wasn't always in this state of crisis, right? Often we've had many guests on that have talked about policy in the late 80s, early 90s. And in the book, you talk about what went wrong. Can you share a little bit in kind of short strokes? There's a lot to it, but drop some of the knowledge on us. Like, how the heck did we get to where we are now in the state of crisis?
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember when folks like David Holchansky and Dan Burns, both of whom fortunately are still around, were leading delegations from the US, from the UK, et cetera, around St. Lawrence neighborhood, and everyone was going, oh my God, Toronto has it sorted. That was, in the late 80s, even into the early 90s, but certainly the late 80s. So what went wrong? There's a couple of decision points that you can look back and go, yeah, maybe that wasn't a great decision. So I locate one of those decision points in the 40s, and in some ways, that was a really exciting time because it was the first time that the Canada as a country really mucked into housing issues. It was World War II. Tons of people were crowding into cities, especially women, to work in war-related industries. There was a question of what servicemen would come home to. So, Remembrance Day, good to remember how are we going to pay back our vets for their service. And there was a really great plan that was put together by a conservative economist from Queens named Curtis that said, look, for the lowest income third of households, we're going to need an ambitious public housing program to build affordable housing and keep it affordable. For middle income people, we need rental housing, and we need rental housing that will stay affordable over time. So in the 1940s, the federal government said to all the provinces, rent freeze now. And they actually said rent freeze now to deal with the predatory landlords who are taking advantage of the housing shortage. And for the richest, third of income, homeownership, great, fantastic, sorted. What happened was that the federal government, and particularly the finance minister and also the prime minister immediately post-war, Louis Saint Laurent, said, no way is the federal government going to get into a public housing program. But what we will do, and it was really ambitious, is it formed the CMHC. The CMHC was there to provide low-cost financing for a whole generation of new homes. There was massive purchase of land for homes, and there was this sort of replicable housing designs. And between that, the federal government was creating a type of home that would be available for $6,000 to $7,000 in 2024 dollars. That's like $80,000 to $90,000, which is really exciting. They work backwards from the price point that a sort of minimum wage single earner family could afford. The only problem was they sold the houses. And so about 1 million homes were enabled between 44 and 60, that is 1944 and 1960. And by the time they were sold the second time, in the 1950s, let's say, the value of the land underneath it had started to really increase. So you have a home in Don Mills, Toronto, that was built as part of this wartime victory houses, they were called post-war, sold for $7,000, then sold in the 50s for about $15,000, and then sold for a third sale, essentially unrenovated, in 2021 for $2.1 million. That's not the house suddenly became a lot nicer, that's the land suddenly became a lot more valuable. So that was sort of decision point number one. Decision point number two happened in the 70s, and in some ways there was cool stuff happening in the 70s. That was the absolute high point. 20 to 25% of home completions were either public housing, co-op housing, community housing. So there was investment as never before from the federal government through long-term low-cost financing, and from provincial governments through public housing authorities, for instance. Lots of non-market housing getting built. Yay! But also, in 72, under Trudeau Père, the father, there was capital gains tax introduced, so taxing wealth, yay, and a principal property exemption. And I mean, it's really logical why it happened the way it was, but housing was going to be the retirement investment. And that was fine when people, like men lived to about 70 and women lived to about 75. So you'd have about 5 to 10 years after retirement funded by the sale of your home. And there was plenty of public housing for seniors, and also a lot of rental housing. So you could downsize in your community. But another thing that happened in the 70s was zoning to make building small apartment buildings a lot more difficult. And another thing that happened in the 70s was an end to a bunch of federal programs to make purpose-built rental easier, taxation type programs. All of that combined together in this sort of perfect storm, so that even by the 80s, home ownership is becoming less affordable, partly because housing is really starting to be treated as an investment. And the other thing that starts happening by the 80s is the federal government is once again freaking out about providing non-market housing, even though every single report from the 1930s onward says there will be no low-income housing, good low-income housing, without a strong non-market sector, a strong public housing or community housing sector. So the 70s, you start seeing the roots of a homelessness disaster, which really starts gearing up after the 1990s as the federal government decides it doesn't want to do it. So it passes the hot potato of housing policy, and particularly non-market housing, to the provinces. And the provinces go, ooh, I don't want this hot potato. So certainly in the case of Ontario, they download it to municipalities who by no means have the revenue or legislative powers to do anything. And social housing flatlines, and purpose-built rental flatlines, and homeownership as investment blows up. And then the third decision point, sorry, I'm a historian, so I start talking a lot about history, is 2018. Yay, the federal government's back in the housing policy world. Boo, it has a whole bunch of really important rights-based legislation and targets about ending homelessness, and reducing the number of households that are in unaffordable, overcrowded, poorly repaired, inadequate homes, but then it doesn't create the programs that will address it. So it has great wording, great targets, falls down in the programs, and that's what we've seen for the last few years.
Wow, what a summation all the way from the 40s to current times. And listen, folks, like we're broad strokes. Read the book, and there's a lot more detail in there. But that's wonderful. We also, when you talk about, like, we hear all sorts of numbers thrown around. The federal government. Well, we need 5 million homes by 2030. 3 million plus 2 million that we already said we needed. We didn't have. Lots of numbers around housing, and it's really hard sometimes to get like a feel like what is the real need? What do we need to consider when we're trying to figure out what the housing need is in Canada?
Yeah, we do need about 6 million homes in the decade. The CMHC was right. But the real question for housing policy is always who needs what homes, where, and at what cost. And I was talking about the post-war period where the federal government said, we need housing in cities and suburbs, and we need it to be at a price point that's affordable to low and moderate income households. And they kind of worked backwards from a cost, which now seems absurd, absurdly low. But they were able to do it. And throughout, again, other countries' histories, you see these seemingly absurd targets, and sometimes they become a complete joke, as to some extent they have in Canada, and sometimes they get done. So the question is, how do they get done, and what do we have to learn from it getting done? How did Sweden, a much poorer country in the 1960s than Canada is today, build 1 million homes in a country of 8 million people? How did it do that in a decade, in affordable homes? How did Singapore, immediately after independence, create 147,000 homes, which was enough to deal with their housing shortages, and created the momentum for Singapore to become one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and certainly in Asia, from a very poor and fraught colony. So there's these stories out there, and are we dumber today? Are we poorer today? Why is it that we can't do what has worked before? How is it that we weren't able to end homelessness by 2028? How is it that we weren't possible? It wasn't possible for us to meet the targets of 530,000 households out of core housing need. The targets were great. The rhetoric was fantastic. What was it about the policies that let us all down? That's always an interesting question to me. Sorry, I went into a rant and I lost sight of your original question. Did I answer it? Or what was it?
It's just about trying to figure out what the real need is. And I think you did. You're talking about, it's not just like this, but it's where is it, how many, what kinds. Like there's a lot of different things to consider.
6 million homes, but I've done, so the federal government has a big problem. It has many big problems. One of them is a big data problem. If you can't count people properly, they don't count in policies. So from 2018 to last year, 2024, students didn't count. They weren't there in calculations of housing need, but they sure as heck were there in the rental market. Homeless people, we still don't have a system like Finland does to accurately or semi-accurately count the number of people who are homeless every year. We have point-in-time counts, which are not it, and are not frequent enough, don't cover enough places, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't know how to count homelessness, which is bad. We don't know how to count the needs of people in congregate housing, in rooming houses, in long-term care, in supportive housing for people with disabilities. We don't count them in, try to find a number of people in supportive housing, let alone in need of supportive housing. It's very hard to find. So migrant farm workers, just to give a relatively small group, but a group that's in general truly inadequately housed, we don't have good numbers. So, all of those groups, well, I tried to calculate it for the Federal Housing Advocate, and I said, we need 3 million homes that are available for less than $1,000 a month, and in many cases, less than $500 a month. And a lot of those are single-person households. It's students, or it's people who are single with disabilities, or it's people who are currently on the street and aren't married or in a relationship, kind of thing. So a lot of it, but not all of it, are single people, but we need lots and lots of studios, 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms that are available at $1,000 a month. And we haven't even wrapped our heads around that as a nation.
It's crazy. I was talking to someone today. We were talking about in Toronto, in the GTA, that because of interest rates, there's a lot of condos that were built, 1-bedroom, smaller condos that they're not unloading right now, right? And they said we're not going to build more until we're able to get rid of but talk about if the government can kind of mandate a little bit of not just that, what's built and how, and so now we're in this conundrum, right? We're in a housing crisis. No one's building. Or very few people are building. They're waiting. It's a bit of a waiting game, but it takes time to catch up, which is crazy. We also are saying we don't have enough people to build the homes, so we're putting people through programs, but then can't get work, and the whole cycle kind of it starts again. I know in your book you talk about a little bit. I think we hear different numbers around it, but it's for every affordable home built, we're losing up to 15. Is it 15 to the private sector that's kind of buying them, so they're no longer affordable?
That's not quite how it works. It's mostly rents going up beyond a point that it's affordable. Yeah. That's the number one mechanism. And then, there's demolition, there's renovation, there is loss of community housing, definitely non-market housing, but it's mainly older apartments, which are the biggest market apartments, which are the biggest source of affordable housing right now, getting repositioned, shall we say, to a point where they're no longer affordable to low-income households.
Yeah, that's when I recently read it was around the REITs that are buying these up, and then I think it's like a 30% jump, and they're owning a bigger and bigger market of especially family size apartments. So it's yeah. So let's talk about solutions. And you talk about, the title, Fixing Canada. Let's talk about fixing. What are some of the solutions? And again, people buy the book because there's more there, but just kind of some of the solutions that you could share.
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts off with targets and sub-targets. So I'm going to use France as an example. In the year 2000, France, a national government, but there's regional governments in France that are the equivalent of provinces. The responsibility for housing had gotten downloaded to them in the previous decade, so the 80s and the 90s, very much like Canada. And 2 bad things were happening. One is that cities were getting more and more exclusionary in their zoning. That'll sound familiar to Canadians. And the second was that where there was public housing, it was concentrated in certain neighborhoods. And that meant that, and quite often those neighborhoods didn't have lots of jobs, lots of public transport. So there was a lot of ghettoization happening. And the national government simply said every municipality has to work towards 20% non-market housing, not 20% of all new builds as non-market, but 20% non-market housing. So that meant that a lot of municipalities were empowered and funded by the national government to acquire some of those homes that were being lost, as well as to redevelop and build new homes that were genuinely affordable, particularly on government land, and particularly financed by by federal long-term financing, to the point where it's a revolving fund, because people eventually, organizations pay back their mortgages, and then it becomes available to new folks. So through right-wing, left-wing, middle-of-the-road governments, that's maintained and been strengthened. In 2016, some cities got targets that were 25%. And Paris, well, across France, it's now 15% non-market. So it's a process, and it takes a generation. It's infrastructure. Infrastructure takes like 30 years. But Paris now has not only a lot more non-market housing than it used to, but I'm talking really showcase, architectural award-winning, wonderful communities in rich parts of Paris. I was at a former barracks called the Caserne de Relais a couple of years ago in Paris. It's in a very rich part of Paris. And it has student housing, family housing, seniors housing around a park on this, including the structure of the former barracks. But there's a big central, area that I guess people used to march. I don't know. And it's this park, and it has cafes, and all the rich people in the neighborhood come and sit at the park and the cafe, and they love it. It's great. It's right next to a metro. So that's what I want to see happen in Canada. I want targets that for deeply affordable non-market housing as part of housing targets. I want looking at the whole set of enablers. How do you zone it? How do you finance it? How do you build it? How do you maintain it? All of that dealt with as part of those targets. And I want us not to build cheap, gross housing. There's cheap gross market housing, there's cheap gross non-market housing. Again, it comes back to beauty and fun, which we can never forget about when we're looking at housing. That's it simply. For many more solutions, read the book.
Well, you know what, Carol, I have to talk about, we got to get past the good enough thing. Like, I think sometimes we have this, and listen, we run programs that I'm saying this is not good enough. It's good enough. Like, we basically, someone lives overnight. We do it out of the cold. It's a mat on the floor. It's some love, food, and then they leave the next morning at 7 a.m. That's not where it ends. But sometimes we're like, oh, that's good enough. Hey, look at us. Pat on the back. Good enough. People will send me something about here's a better sleeping bag where people can stay out, or a better tent. Like, but is that what you want for your mom or dad? Like, if they were like, so we have to get past this good enough. And I hear what you say too, like the
And even for students, can I just say, even for students. So when I was in Melbourne, Australia recently, I'm such a tragic that I can't visit a place and not look at their affordable housing. It's just impossible for me. So I got a tour by a big company called Unilodge, which has 53,000 student beds in Australia and New Zealand, and has recently expanded to Canada. They are an incredibly lucrative market provider. They have these unbelievably tiny cubicles for students. In some cases, it doesn't have cooking facilities. In some cases, it'll have a kitchenette and a private bathroom, all within, let's say, 50 square feet, which I don't know whether you can visualize that, but it's like being below decks in a submarine, except that it has a window and a view, and it's right downtown. So that's great. At $500 a week, which is roughly $2,000 a month, Australian dollar, Canadian dollar, let's call it 2,000 a month. Could I live there for a year? If the alternative was like 14 people in a 2-bedroom flat, which it is for students, yeah, I could live there for a year. Is it somewhere where my mental and physical health, and to be fair, it's schmecky, it's really nice finishes and things like that. There are common rooms, totally. And as I say, it's very close to the university, so that's all great. Would it be good for my mental health to be there for a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years for a degree? I don't think so. I think I'd need a little space where someone could come and visit sometimes, Yeah, so I don't know how low we can go. But that's students who we treat with a certain measure of contempt. We treat homeless people with a great deal more contempt. And like, wouldn't you be happy with a sprung tent? Wouldn't you love a tiny house, which is, if you're lucky, 50 square feet? And again, if you're lucky, has a private bathroom and some sort of cooking facility. Would you want your mother to live there? Would you want your kid to live there? These are all questions we need to ask.
Yes. If it's not good enough for, would you want to? And no, I wouldn't. And so I think we need to do better. And that's the same thing we talk at Cammins when now people are talking about, hey, we're going to use this notwithstanding clause. We're going to move people out. It's, we don't need better laws to push people around. We need adequate housing and choices too, right? Where people are like, I don't want to go back to that shelter. It's overcrowded. I was beat up. And I mean, despite the best efforts of staff and everything that's going on, it's just, I don't feel safe. I don't feel dignified, and that I have any dignity.
I've been in both shelters and purported supportive housing, and again, it's not necessarily the fault of the provider, it's the fault of the funding formula, where I can very much understand why people would choose a tent.
I mean, I think too, but when COVID hit, there was like, we got to stop this, like jamming everyone in small space. We need space. And slowly we're creeping back to how many bunk beds can you get in that room? And I know this from our own, and listen, I understand too, that like our region and communities are under huge stress to get more people. Listen, bottom line is people can't die tonight. So jam them in there, but we can't, it can't be where it ends. Let's talk about how your book's been received. I saw a picture recently. You looked very small next to Sean Fraser. You were holding the book and I think you came up to his elbow.
On a completely different latitude, man. Yeah, I need a step ladder to kind of be.
He is a tall dude, and then more kind of in scale with the Prime Minister. So you got to talk
to be
about
fair,
the book.
Justin, as one of his great social skills, has the ability to kind of crouch down so that you look like you're on the same latitude. You're actually in the same room. And I'm sure Sean has that ability as well. He's so tall. So yes, I did have the opportunity to present to the cabinet back in September and gave both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Housing copies of the book. They haven't sent me a review yet, but they do have it. And I'm not going to nag them or anything. It is, as I always say to people who read the book, you don't have to read it cover to cover. You can read a chapter and then you can come back and read another chapter. That's okay. A lot of people are reading it, and exactly the people I want to read it. So who do I want to read this book? I want people in positions of political power, certainly. I also want people who are in the business of developing and providing and building and designing housing, absolutely. But I also want concerned citizens to be able to read it, understand a little bit more about the complex housing system in Canada and a little bit more about what they can do. Like the book begins by saying, whenever I talk to anybody, a journalist or a neighbor or somebody I'm asking for funding, I hear one of two things. The first is if they're under 40, I hear a horror story about their own housing. And the second is at some point, someone will say, why is housing so complicated? So this is a guide for the perplexed. It is a complex system. There are a lot of different inputs into it, but you can get up in the helicopter. You can look at the system. You can look at the role of the various levels of government, the private sector, of community sector, etc., and go, yeah, this is what we need to do. It's not rocket science. If it was rocket science, there'd be a problem. I failed grade 10 math 3 times, or twice, as I say in the book. I actually passed the 3rd time. So if I can figure it out, anyone can figure it out.
Well, I think that's quite a humble statement. But I mean, if people want to, and you should, buy this book, Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis, where can they get it?
Hopefully at your independent bookseller near you. If you aren't able to find it, and of course some folks in, for instance, Australia can't find it through their local independent bookseller, they should get in touch with UBC On Point Press and have a copy sent to you. It is in paper book. It is available as a downloadable read. I'm hoping to do an audiobook.
I was going to ask you, yeah. Cool.
I'm hoping to do an audiobook because people of my children's generation want to hear the audiobook at twice speed. So twice I'm like this if I'm going to be talking. You want that? I'll give you that. Yes, at the moment it's available on your computer / phone if you can squint, plus in beautiful hard copy with a lovely cover. At any independent bookseller near you, and also big booksellers.
Amazing, very cool. So, what's next for you? You're doing some work with U of T. What else is going on? What's next?
I think the thing that excites me the most right now is I'm doing some thinking about responsible investing. I mean, I'm at the stage where I'm about ready to cash in my retirement investments, and I want to know that my investments are helping the planet in the next 7 generations. And unfortunately, a lot of investors right now, including, union pension funds, and that's where some of my pension funds come from, are funding the wrong thing. My husband is in ESG, environmental social governance, responsible investing, and I know that there's so much we can do in terms of, as individual investors, in our own small way, towards a better planet for people. And I'm really interested in that particular issue. I'm also, I'm working on a number of other research projects, but that's a particular one that has me most intrigued right now. I think it's a natural thing as we go through a difficult set of political times internationally, that we start thinking about what we can do as individuals. I tend to think about what can government do, but I think we also need to talk about how we can advocate for better results as individuals, as organizations, but also, there are $7 trillion of investment in Canada. Let's never say that we're a poor country and we can't do great things.
No, and well said. I think many times too, people have no idea investment wise, like you're investing, as you said, and it's not through because I don't want to invest in help, and they just don't pay enough attention. They're looking at the bottom line, but you can have a great bottom line, but also invest in things that are going to make a difference. Like, because also it's not a straight line sometimes how people are investing. They have no idea that they actually might be part of the problem with like financialization or different things.
It was only 5 years ago when I started thinking about, retirement. I'd always put something aside that I started going, where's my money going again? oh my God.
Yeah.
But there are wonderful social finance and also, I think mainstream finance is saying, what can we do? Just to give two examples, Scotiabank says that we need to double non-market housing. The Royal Bank says we need much, much more affordable housing, and that's a great way to jumpstart the economy. Great. Let's talk about how you can put your money where your mouth is.
Yes, exactly. Well, listen, folks, go out, buy the book. And again, it's very it's a great read and very kind of breaks it down, as Carolyn was saying, into different pieces, right? You could piece at a time, but I think you don't have to be housing nerds in this sector to really understand. We should. It's every day we're bombarded with different pieces now in the media around the housing crisis, poverty, like what's going on and how expensive it is. And you're right, elections are, won and lost around this. Absolutely. At the end of the day, people are saying, we're talking, inflation's better, this is better, this is better. And people are like, I still can't afford to buy groceries and, pay my rent. So you're not doing it. So people need to pay attention. And people need to know what is the need, what are the solutions. It's all here. Go out, get Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis. Carolyn, thanks so much for actually taking the time and putting this on pen to paper, so to say, and writing this book. And thanks for taking the time to come on the show today to talk to us.
It's always a pleasure, Michael.